The air, 2 miles above the frozen, scarred landscape of the Ruhr Valley, was not just thin and cold. It was thick with the scent of high-octane fuel and the metallic stink of fear. Major Ethan Kincaid, codenamed Spectre, didn't feel the cold through his thick flight suit. He felt the tremor of impending disaster. He was flying lead escort in his P-51 Mustang, Vengeance, a silvery spearhead riding shotgun for a formation of 60 B-17 flying fortresses, heading toward the Reich's industrial heart. The mission brief had been clear. This target, a critical synthetic fuel plant near Luna, was defended by everything the Luftwaffe had left. Today was not about achieving air superiority. It was about surviving the inevitable slaughter. Kincaid checked his 6 again. His wingman, Lieutenant Jimmy Mule Harris, was perfectly positioned, barely 200 yards off his starboard wingtip. Kincaid felt a momentary surge of confidence, then dismissed it. Confidence was a luxury. Survival was chemistry, physics, and sheer brutal luck. The dread intensified not with a slow build, but with a sudden, tearing sound, like wet silk ripping apart. It wasn't flak. It was the noise of 30 piston engines, operating in desperation. Below and ahead, where the sky should have been clear blue, a chaotic, desperate swarm erupted from the haze, the legendary fanatical Sturmgruppen of JG-300, flying the highly capable Bf-109K for Kurfürst. They weren't flying orderly attacks. They were diving in a ragged, overwhelming funnel of speed and cannon fire. The German attack was designed to break the bomber stream instantly. Kincaid screamed a warning over the R/T, his voice tight. "Break left! Swarm! Swarm at 1 o'clock low!" Before the word low had fully left his lips, the air dissolved into chaos. Tracers streaked past his canopy, incandescent lines of destruction seeking the aluminum flesh of his aircraft. He yanked the stick hard, throwing the Mustang into a defensive split-S maneuver designed to gain speed, sacrificing altitude for maneuverability. As he rolled inverted, he caught a horrifying glimpse. A pair of K4s had latched onto Mule Harris, firing synchronized bursts. Harris's Mustang shuddered, belched a stream of coolant, and then, in a terrifying flash of orange, disintegrated, tumbling end over end. A smoking ruin of sacrifice. Harris's brief, panicked squawk of "bailing, bailing," was cut short by silence. Kincaid didn't have time for the shock, the anger, or the grief. Jimmy Harris was gone. Kincaid was now alone, separated from the main escort group, which was fighting a desperate battle 3,000 feet higher up. Down in the thick of the incoming German formation, Kincaid realized the brutal geometry of his situation. He was a single point of opposition against a relentless, concentrated attack force aimed squarely at the vulnerable bomb bays of the B-17s. His altimeter read 25,000 feet. The immediate threat consisted of 5 Messerschmitts, painted in dark greens and grays, flashing toward him in a deadly cone. Kincaid knew precisely when the impossible clock started, the moment his wingman vaporized and he committed himself to a low-level intervention. 5 minutes, 7 kills. It was a statistical impossibility, a suicide run, but the sight of the German planes already lining up on the tail gunners of the lead B-17 element hardened his resolve into a cold, lethal focus. He rammed the throttle to the firewall, engaging the war emergency power, feeling the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine roar its protest at the excessive demand, and plunged directly into the heart of the swarm. The commitment was instant, brutal, and irreversible. Kincaid's adrenaline was not a rush. It was a pure, cold anesthetic, dulling everything but the optical clarity of the threat matrix surrounding him. The 5 K4s were spread out, but their lead element, an arrogant pilot who opened fire too early from an excessive range, became Kincaid's first target. Kincaid ignored the incoming cannon fire, trusting the speed of the Mustang and the geometry of collision. He maintained his course head-on, forcing the German pilot to choose between collision and brake. The German, perhaps unused to such reckless aggression from a lone American fighter, hesitated for a crucial half-second before pulling hard to port. That half-second was eternity. Kincaid squeezed the trigger, unleashing a torrent of .50 caliber fury. The 6 machine guns, synchronized perfectly, poured molten lead into the exposed underside and wing root of the Messerschmitt as it pulled away. The result was instantaneous. A sickening crunch, a flash of fire erupting from the engine cowling, and a plume of black smoke marking the pilot's final, uncontrollable dive toward the distant, frozen Earth. Kill 1, confirmed. Kincaid barely registered the victory. The speed differential was immense, and the act of killing had cost him vital momentum. He pulled up sharply, banking into a tight turn, searching for the next threat. He spotted 2 more 109s, flying in close predatory formation, attempting to execute a classic boom and zoom attack against him from above. They saw the lone Mustang as easy prey, a stray sheep cut from the herd. They were wrong. Kincaid knew that in the chaos of a large, high-speed dogfight, the greatest danger wasn't running into the enemy, but running out of energy. He needed altitude, but he couldn't climb into the maelstrom of the main escort battle. He focused on using the P-51's superior low-altitude speed and high G turn rate to his advantage, forcing the heavier, less nimble 109s to bleed speed in the turn. The Germans dove, their wings whistling, 30mm cannons primed. Kincaid waited until they were almost on top of him, then initiated a radical maneuver known as a high G high deflection turn, pulling the stick back so hard that his vision grayed momentarily, the blood draining from his head. He felt the crushing weight of 9GS pushing him deep into his seat, the structural components of vengeance groaning under the strain. The maneuver, perfectly executed, threw the first Messerschmitt into an overshoot, completely ruining its firing solution. The German pilot, realizing his mistake, attempted to follow Kincaid's tight turn, but the centrifugal force of the high G maneuver had slowed him too much. Kincaid rolled out perfectly behind his momentary pursuer, lining up the glowing reticule of his gun sight with the exposed tail surfaces of the Messerschmitt. He thumbed the firing button for a 3-second burst. The impact was surgical. The 109's rudder and elevator controls shredded instantly. The aircraft, now uncontrollable, whipped into a flat spin, accelerating rapidly toward the ground. Kill 2, secured in less than 60 seconds. The efficiency was terrifying, born from thousands of hours of training and the raw panic of knowing that any lapse in judgment meant a fiery death. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. 2 down. 5 minutes shrinking rapidly. The fight became a dizzying, three-dimensional ballet of death, where milliseconds dictated fate. The third Messerschmitt pilot, witnessing the sudden demise of his comrade, tried to evade by plunging into a tight, defensive spiral. This was a grave mistake against the P-51. While the Bf-109K-4 was a remarkable climber, its performance in tight, sustained turning fights at medium altitude was inferior to the Mustang's laminar flow wing design. Kincaid knew this limitation intimately. Instead of following the tight spiral, which would have dissipated his own energy, he utilized a strategic maneuver. The low yo-yo, sacrificing altitude momentarily to gain speed, and then, using that speed, pulling back up in a wide, sweeping curve to place himself directly above and behind the spiraling enemy. This move allowed him to maintain his energy state while effectively cutting the corner on the Germans' downward path. The Messerschmitt pilot, fixated on his defensive corkscrew, looked up too late. Kincaid was already there, dropping out of the sky like a vengeful hawk. The German attempted a last-ditch defensive break, snapping the stick hard to the right, but the deflection was insufficient. Kincaid held the trigger down for a decisive 4-second burst. The stream of .50 caliber rounds raked the fuselage from wing root to cockpit. The Messerschmitt didn't explode. It simply ceased to function, the engine cutting out instantly, the propeller windmilling to a sickening halt, the cockpit glass shattering inward. The pilot slumped forward, the aircraft now a dead weight plummeting through the atmosphere. Kill 3. The radio crackled with garbled German chatter. The enemy pilots were realizing that the lone P-51 was not a vulnerable target, but a tactical buzzsaw operating outside the expected rules of engagement. Kincaid glanced at his fuel gauge. The war emergency power setting was drinking high-octane avgas at a terrifying rate, but the fight was far from over. He leveled out momentarily, pulling away from the vapor trail of his third victim, only to find himself instantly under attack again. Two more Messerschmitts, previously positioned to engage the high cover, saw the opening and pounced, executing a coordinated attack from opposite directions. This was the classic sandwich maneuver, designed to force the target into an impossible choice: turn into one attacker and expose the 6 o'clock to the other. Kincaid refused to turn. Instead, he executed a radical, high-speed aileron roll, flipping the Mustang onto its back and pulling through the horizontal, momentarily confusing the synchronization of the two German pilots. As he completed the maneuver, he found himself pulling away from the first attacker, but directly closing on the second. The German, anticipating a defensive break, was caught completely off guard by the aggressive, almost suicidal counterattack. Kincaid fired a short, sharp burst, aiming for the engine cowling. His aim was slightly off, but the round struck the pressurized coolant system. Steam immediately burst from the Messerschmitt's nose, obscuring the pilot's vision and marking his imminent mechanical failure. Kincaid didn't wait for the confirmation. He broke violently left, knowing the damaged German plane would be forced to disengage. He was now down to 4 functioning guns. 2 of his 6 barrels had temporarily jammed due to the continuous firing strain, adding another layer of mechanical stress to the deadly situation. The battlefield was shifting, the noise was constant, and the physical exhaustion was beginning to set in, but the B-17s were still flying, and Kincaid was still alive. The immediate, desperate defense of his own aircraft gave way to the terrifying realization of the raison d'etre for his presence: the bombers. Looking up through the oil-smeared canopy, Kincaid saw the lead formation of flying fortresses shuddering under a concentrated barrage of cannon fire. The German tactic was simple: overwhelm the escort and then use the heavily armed Sturmgruppen to methodically dismantle the B-17s. He watched helplessly as the bomb bay doors of one B-17, the Iron Duke, fluttered open, not to drop bombs, but to release its surviving crew, parachutes blossoming like fragile white fungi against the hostile gray sky, just before the bomber itself was consumed by fire. This spectacle snapped Kincaid out of the purely defensive mindset. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was buying time for 80 young men still strapped into the rattling hulks above him. He decided to turn himself into bait, the largest possible distraction. He executed a searing climb, placing himself between the bombers and the densest concentration of Messerschmitts. For Bf-109s, seeing the American ace climb directly into their path, momentarily abandoned their attack on the formation and focused their combined energy on him. This was exactly what Kincaid wanted, even though it meant facing 4 separate, determined attackers simultaneously. He leveled off at 27,000 feet, where the air was thinner and the Mustang's handling was becoming sluggish, yet still marginally superior to the 109s in a sustained energy fight. The Germans, sensing a decisive numerical advantage, attacked in pairs. Kincaid met the first pair head-on, banking hard and using aggressive rudder input to maintain his line of flight while adjusting his aim. He knew he couldn't afford another sustained burst. He had to rely on quick, precise deflection shots. As the first pair roared past, Kincaid pulled up and rolled inverted, catching the leader of the pair just as he was starting his own climb. It was a nearly impossible angle, a high-side deflection shot fired while Kincaid was upside down and pulling through. He fired a single, calculated half-second burst. The rounds impacted the German's wing fuel tank. The resulting explosion wasn't large, but it was decisive, tearing away a large section of the wing and sending the Messerschmitt tumbling out of control. Kill 4 verified. Kincaid righted his aircraft, his vision now swimming dangerously from the repeated high G stress. The second pair of 109s, shocked by the rapid, almost casual execution of their partner, hesitated, a fatal error. They momentarily split, attempting to regain a positional advantage. Kincaid seized the opportunity, throwing the Mustang into a tight horizontal turn, directly contradicting his earlier need for vertical separation. The gamble paid off. The momentary separation of the German fighters allowed him to maneuver into a tail chase on the furthest Messerschmitt. He closed the distance rapidly, the raw speed of the P-51 a devastating weapon in itself. As he lined up the shot, He noticed the small, personal detail on the German's rudder, a black tulip marking, likely an experienced pilot. Kincaid didn't pause for reflection. He fired his remaining 4 guns in a concentrated stream, focusing on the pilot's compartment. The cockpit disintegrated under the impact, the aircraft falling away instantly, lifeless. Kill 5. The remaining 2 Messerschmitts suddenly found themselves alone against a pilot who seemed possessed by an unnerving, lethal omnipresence. The atmosphere of battle was shifting from an ambush to a rout, solely because of one man's refusal to yield. The relentless succession of kills felt less like flying and more like operating a highly advanced, vibrating machine gun platform. Kincaid was no longer executing planned maneuvers. He was reacting purely on instinct, a biological supercomputer calculating trajectories and closing speeds faster than conscious thought allowed. The 5-minute mark was looming, and though he had decimated the local opposition, he was dangerously exposed. His ammo counters were flashing ominous red warnings, his oxygen usage was spiking from the hyperventilation, and the engine temperature gauge was climbing steadily, protesting the sustained use of maximum power. The 2 remaining Messerschmitts, now displaying caution, were circling wide, trying to re-establish a tactical advantage by using the sun. Kincaid didn't wait for them. He knew that hesitation meant death. He initiated a high-speed dive, trying to force them to follow him into the thicker air below, where his engines still held a slight edge. They followed, perhaps eager to lure him into an area where ground fire was more prevalent. As they plunged toward 18,000 feet, Kincaid pulled a massive, high-speed yo-yo, trading his descent speed for immediate altitude gain, forcing his pursuers to burn excessive energy to keep up. This moment, suspended between the gravity of the Earth and the terrifying pull of G-forces, offered Kincaid a fleeting, terrible opportunity for contemplation. Why was he here? Was this singular, violent act of defiance against impossible odds driven by duty, or by the raw, consuming need for revenge for his wingmen? He was one man, risking everything, sacrificing his own aircraft and life potential, just so a few dozen bombers could reach a target that might be rebuilt in 6 months. Was the cost of his 5 kills worth the terror he was feeling, the inevitable exhaustion and damage he was accumulating? If you were Major Kincaid in that cockpit, operating on pure adrenaline with death staring you down, would you have pushed for the 7th kill, knowing that retreat meant survival, but continuation meant fulfilling the mission by guaranteeing the bomber's safety? Share your thoughts below about where duty ends and self-preservation must begin. The thought was fleeting, shattered by the reality of the fight. The lead German, straining to maintain the vertical climb, momentarily stalled. Kincaid, now positioned directly above, leveraged the P-51's superior high-altitude performance. He dropped the nose and fired a final, calculated burst from his 2 remaining reliable guns. The German pilot, caught completely flat-footed, had no time to react. The Mustang's weight of fire tore through the Messerschmitt's fragile structure. The entire tail section separated cleanly from the main fuselage. Kill 6. The blast of debris rocked Kincaid's aircraft violently, slamming his head against the headrest. The remaining German broke off instantly, turning tail and diving for the clouds, the will to fight visibly evaporating. Kincaid watched him go, his finger instinctively reaching for the trigger, but he checked himself. He was effectively out of ammunition for a proper engagement, and the clock was ticking down to 0. The brief moment of reprieve did not last. The Messerschmitt that Kincaid had damaged earlier, the one streaming coolant, suddenly reappeared out of a cloud layer, staggering but functional, piloted by a man clearly driven by a desperate fanaticism or perhaps simply the inability to retreat due to mechanical failure. He was low, slow, and desperate, attempting to limp back toward the safety of the German lines. However, he presented an immediate, if slow, threat to the returning B-17s, which were now starting their long, vulnerable turn back to the west. Kincaid knew that even a damaged enemy fighter could make one final, deadly pass on the formation. The Mustang's structure was rattled. A stray piece of shrapnel from his 6th kill had peppered his canopy, creating a spiderweb of cracks that obscured his forward view, forcing him to rely heavily on his peripheral vision and the side windows. His fuel pressure was alarming low, and the cockpit warning light for the oil temperature was glowing ominously red. The cumulative strain on the airframe was immense. The controls felt sluggish and heavy, refusing to respond with the sharpness they had an hour prior. He was a mechanical ghost, running on fumes and sheer nerve. Despite the technical limitations, Kincaid focused on the final solitary target. This wasn't a dogfight anymore. It was an exercise in stalking. He positioned himself high above the Messerschmitt, using the altitude to convert to speed, conserving his dwindling fuel supply. The German pilot, realizing he was being pursued, tried a weak defensive weave, but the damaged aircraft could only manage half-hearted maneuvers. Kincaid descended in a shallow, high-speed pursuit curve, the air rushing past the fractured canopy with a terrifying hiss. He armed his guns, knowing this would be his final, definitive attempt. His ammunition counter for the port inner gun read 0. The starboard inner gun showed fewer than 20 rounds remaining. He had to make the shot count. He closed the distance until the Messerschmitt filled his gun sight, focusing his aim slightly ahead of the cockpit, the classic lead for a moving target. He muttered a silent, desperate plea to the mechanical gods of the Merlin engine and squeezed the trigger. Only a short, stuttering stream of tracers erupted. The shells hit low, tearing into the rudder and the very end of the fuselage. Not enough. The Messerschmitt continued its limping flight, smoking but not destroyed. Kincaid pulled up sharply, avoiding an overshoot, the frustration palpable, tasting like burnt cordite. He realized he needed an absolute, undeniable killing blow, and he had only one gun left with a handful of rounds. He couldn't risk another deflection shot. He had to get directly on the enemy's 6, so close that deflection was irrelevant. He turned the Mustang sharply, ignoring the whining protest of the airframe, and threw everything into closing the distance again, sacrificing what little remaining speed he had left in the vertical plane. The duel was agonizingly slow, conducted in the heavy, lower-altitude atmosphere, where every foot of altitude mattered. The damaged German, likely out of ammo himself, was trying desperately to reach the protection of local anti-aircraft artillery. Kincaid pushed the throttle forward one last time, momentarily ignoring the red oil temp light, gaining just enough speed to inch closer. The gap narrowed 100 yards, 50 yards, 30 yards. He was dangerously close to the enemy's prop wash. He lined up his final, precious few rounds directly onto the enemy pilot's headrest. His finger tightened, the outcome of the entire engagement hanging on a literal handful of .50 caliber slugs. The trigger press was not aggressive. It was a gentle, definitive command. Click, click, click. The final, meager burst from the last working machine gun stitched a perfect line of destruction right through the engine mount and into the cockpit area of the desperate German fighter. This time, the effect was decisive. The Messerschmitt shuddered violently, its remaining structural integrity compromised, and it instantly rolled over, falling into an uncontrolled, corkscrewing dive. Kincaid watched it descend for a moment, a column of dark, ragged smoke marking its path, until it disappeared into the industrial haze below. Kill 7. He instinctively checked his watch. The second hand had just swept past the exact 5-minute mark since the moment Jimmy Harris's Mustang had vaporized. 7 confirmed kills in 5 brutal minutes. The sheer physical and mental expenditure required to achieve that impossible feat left Kincaid momentarily paralyzed. The aircraft, Vengeance, suddenly felt heavy, silent, and deeply damaged. The deafening roar of battle was replaced by the terrifying sound of silence, punctuated only by the whistle of wind rushing past the cracked canopy and the rhythmic, labored thumping of his own heart, trying to beat its way out of his chest. He was alone, floating in a sky suddenly empty of immediate enemies, surrounded only by the vapor trails and the faint, black smudges of the aerial battlefield. The silence was deafening, the transition from hellish intensity to absolute solitude almost unbearable. The adrenaline, which had been his master for the past 5 minutes, began to recede, leaving behind a crippling wave of nausea and bone-deep fatigue. Kincaid forced himself to check his instruments. Fuel was critical. Oil pressure was dropping rapidly. 2 guns functioning, but effectively out of ammunition. He was flying a wounded machine deep in enemy territory, far from friendly escort cover. Survival now depended not on aggression, but on the delicate art of nursing a dying engine home. He throttled back, adjusting the prop pitch carefully, trying to find the most efficient cruising speed that wouldn't cause the Merlin engine to seize up. The sky, once a canvas for aerial mayhem, now looked vast, indifferent, and menacing. The B-17 formation, now far ahead and slightly higher, looked like a distant, silver centipede, steadily making its way west. Kincaid swung his battered Mustang onto an intercept course, a lone, damaged satellite returning to the mothership. The psychological weight of the 7 kills settled upon him not as pride, but as a chilling numbness. 7 men, 7 separate moments of calculated murder, condensed into the span of a coffee break. He tasted blood. He had bitten clean through his cheek during one of the high-G maneuvers, and the smell of hydraulic fluid was overpowering in the cockpit. He was alive, miraculously whole, but profoundly shaken. He had executed the impossible, but the true test now was the 3-hour journey back across occupied territory, relying solely on the strained lifeblood of his wounded engine and the hope that no roving German patrol would stumble across the slow, vulnerable form of vengeance limping home. The journey west was a blur of agonizing physical discomfort and heightened paranoia. Every shudder of the engine, every fluctuation in the fuel pressure gauge, sent a jolt of pure dread through Kincaid. He had to descend significantly, trading the thin, performance-enhancing air of high altitude for the thicker, warmer, and more dangerous air below 15,000 feet, simply because his damaged engine couldn't handle the strain of the thinner atmosphere. This low altitude exposed him to medium flak and the potential for opportunistic ground attacks, but it was a risk he had to take. He flew through layers of broken cloud cover, constantly scanning the skies, expecting the sudden silhouette of a Focke-Wulf 190 or a fresh staffel of Messerschmitts eager to capitalize on his vulnerability. He kept the Mustang's nose pointed slightly high, compensating for the accumulating oil leakage that was now steadily coating his windscreen. He could barely see ahead, relying almost entirely on glancing out the side panels and wiping the smeared glass with the heel of his glove. Hours dragged into an eternity. He passed over German rail yards, where he could see the furious bursts of light gray flak aimed at the main bomber stream far above him. He was too low, too slow, and too irrelevant to warrant a dedicated response, thankfully. The sheer solitude of his flight was a stark contrast to the 5 minutes of chaos. It gave him far too much time to replay the sequence of kills. The snap of the Messerschmitt's wing on kill 4, the dead silence after kill 3, the overwhelming G-force during the high deflection shot that secured kill 2. They weren't glorious memories. They were cinematic snapshots of violence, each one a testament to his survival and the deaths of 7 other young men. As the coastline of the Netherlands finally appeared on the distant horizon, a faint, gray line separating the hostile continent from the relative safety of the North Sea, Kincaid felt the first true relaxation in his shoulders since the engagement began. It was a premature relief, quickly suppressed, but the sight of the water represented the border between life and death. He crossed the enemy coast at wavetop height, trying to minimize radar signature, the sea spray occasionally flicking against his oil-coated canopy. It wasn't until he was well out over the gray expanse of the North Sea, far beyond the reach of any reasonable German patrol, that he allowed himself to contact friendly air-sea rescue frequencies. His voice was hoarse, ragged, and barely audible over the static. Spectre 1 to base, returning solo, critical damage, fuel low, estimate arrival in 45 minutes. The reply, faint but clear, offered relief. Base understands, Spectre 1. We have you on radar. Prepare for immediate priority landing. Welcome home, Major. The simple phrase, welcome home, brought a sudden, unexpected sting of tears to Kincaid's eyes. He banked the battered Vengeance toward England, the metal carcass shaking rhythmically, carrying its exhausted pilot and its deadly, unbelievable secret. The landing at Debden was less a controlled descent and more a controlled crash. Kincaid brought the P-51 down hard, the damaged landing gear protesting with a shriek of tortured metal as the tires finally kissed the runway tarmac. The aircraft veered momentarily, but Kincaid wrestled the yoke, fighting the damaged hydraulics until the Mustang finally rolled to a halt near the hangars. He cut the engine. The resulting silence was absolute, a profound physical void that replaced the ceaseless noise of combat and flight. He sat for a full minute, unable to move, the seat harness digging painfully into his chest, the smell of cordite and burned oil lingering like a curse. Ground crew personnel, alerted by his urgent distress call, raced toward the plane. They arrived not to the sight of a triumphant ace, but a ghost. The canopy was finally wrestled open, and the cold English air flooded the cockpit, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and diesel. Kincaid had to be helped out. His legs, cramped and trembling from the immense G-forces, were initially useless. He leaned heavily against the fuselage, staring numbly at the damage. The right wing was riddled with holes, the leading edge feathered like a bird struck by buckshot. The tail stabilizer was scarred by 3 distinct cannon impacts, and the entire nose section was weeping oil and coolant. The crew chief, an old, grizzled master sergeant named Wallace, slowly shook his head, running a gloved hand over the shattered canopy glass. "Jesus, Major, what the hell did you fly through?" Kincaid could only manage a croaking sound. He was immediately whisked away for medical attention and a mandatory debriefing, a process that felt more surreal than the dogfight itself. Sitting in the sterile atmosphere of the operations room, sipping scalding hot coffee, Kincaid recounted the mission. He spoke of the defense of the B-17s, the loss of Harris, and the chaotic intervention. When he reached the part about the high-speed pursuit and the sequential kills, the small room fell into a disbelieving silence. The intelligence officer, a meticulous captain named Davies, paused, his pencil hovering over his notepad. "Major Kincaid, let's go over this section carefully. You are reporting 6 confirmed, plus 1 probable, within the window of 5 minutes, starting when you broke formation." Kincaid nodded, rubbing the dried blood from his lower lip. 7 confirmed, Captain. They all went in. Davies looked at the clock, then back at Kincaid's gaunt, exhausted face. "Major, that rate of engagement is unprecedented. It defies the physics of air combat. We are talking about 7 distinct engagement maneuvers, target acquisitions, and kills against the best fighters the Reich has left. Are you certain of the timing and the total number?" Kincaid met his gaze, his voice now regaining a fraction of its former strength, cold and steady. "Captain, I was there. I did not have the luxury of a stopwatch, but I know precisely the moment the fight started, and I know precisely the moment the last one went down. 5 minutes. The sheer, cold certainty in his tone was more convincing than any footage. The intelligence officer finally lowered his pencil, a look of awe and horror replacing his skepticism. He realized he was documenting not just a heroic dogfight, but a statistical impossibility achieved through desperate, superhuman effort. Kincaid, watching the captain process the magnitude of the event, realized that the true exhaustion was yet to come, the burden of carrying the weight of that impossible victory. The legend of Spectre Kincaid solidified almost instantly, long before the gun camera footage could be processed and verified. Pilots and ground crew circulated the unbelievable tale. A lone Mustang, cut off from the main force, tearing through the elite Messerschmitts like a scythe through wheat, 7 kills condensed into the frantic, brutal span of 5 minutes. It became the defining story of the 8th Air Force for weeks, a morale booster that stretched the limits of credibility but captured the desperate heroism required to maintain dominance over the Reich. The high command, initially skeptical of the total number, had to concede reality when the B-17 crew reports corroborated Kincaid's version of events. They had witnessed the solitary P-51 seemingly teleporting between targets, a single silver blur disrupting the entire German attack. The gun camera footage, once developed, offered fragmented but undeniable proof. Though some shots were too close or too fast to register clearly, there had been 7 distinct flashes of impact, 7 violent, conclusive endings caught on film. Kincaid, however, found no solace in the newfound fame. He felt disconnected from the hero they described. The man who sat in the officers' club, silently nursing a lukewarm beer, was not the cold, focused executioner who had dominated the sky. That man belonged to the machine, to the P-51, and to the pressure cooker of 25,000 feet. The true cost of the 5 minutes was the profound emotional isolation. He had fought a battle so intense, so close to the edge of death, that it separated him fundamentally from his peers. They saw the ace. He saw the 7 young faces that had been obliterated by his hand, regardless of the necessity. He became withdrawn, haunted by the clarity of the events. His maintenance crew chief, Sergeant Wallace, noticed the change instantly. Wallace, a father figure who had seen dozens of young men burned out by combat stress, treated Kincaid's plane, Vengeance, with a special, almost reverent care. He worked tirelessly to repair the riddled fuselage and coax the abused Merlin back to perfect health, understanding that the pilot and the machine were inextricably linked. Wallace never asked about the 7 kills, only about the mechanical well-being of the aircraft. This silence was Kincaid's only comfort. He returned to flight operations reluctantly. While he earned the coveted 7-leaf clover, marking on his fuselage that day, a personalized tally badge reflecting the unparalleled achievement, Kincaid saw it not as a badge of honor, but as 7 gravestones painted on his aluminum skin. He understood deeply that his survival was not just skill, but a fluke of fate, and that such an intense application of violence could not be sustained. He continued to fly escort missions, always leading, always dedicated, but the raw, spontaneous joy of flying was gone, replaced by a grim, calculated efficiency. The impossible dogfight had granted him immortality in the annals of aviation, but had demanded the price of his peace, leaving him an eternal specter of the fierce, solitary battle fought high above the frozen wastes of Germany. He had pushed the limits of the P-51, but more dangerously, he had pushed the limits of the human pilot, and the echoes of that 5 minutes would follow him long after the war was over, a silent, heavy memory carried back over the English Channel on the wings of his silver Mustang. The story became a whispered truth, a testament to the fact that when pressed beyond the rational breaking point, certain men possessed the terrifying capability to achieve the truly impossible. His name became synonymous with the raw, aggressive power of the American fighter pilot, the embodiment of air superiority achieved through sheer, unadulterated will.